All right, let's talk about a tax that was only supposed to be a temporary fix, but, well, it ended up sticking around for half a century. It's a pretty wild story about how these temporary government measures can accidentally become permanent, and sometimes pretty problematic.
I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? How does something that's supposed to be short-term, something designed for a crisis, just stay for 50 years? It's a puzzle that really shows you how government finances can get all tangled up in their own history, creating what some have called a major national distortion.
Okay, so Section 1, the 50-year temporary tax. To really get why this was such a huge deal, we've got to first break down what this tax actually was.
So, it all kicked off way back in 1974, right in the middle of the first oil shock. The government was scrambling for money to build roads, so they came up with this provisional, or temporary, surtax on gasoline. And you gotta love that word they used, temporary. That's the key to this whole story.
And this wasn't just some tiny little tax either. We're talking about a pretty hefty chunk of change. When you added the standard gas tax and this quote-unquote temporary one together, it came out to about 53.8 yen for every single liter of gas. That adds up fast.
So what does that actually mean for you at the pump? Well, check this out. When you go to fill up your tank, a whopping 40% of the price you were paying wasn't even for the gasoline itself. Nope. It was all taxes, and a big piece of that was this supposedly temporary one.
All right, next up, the tax that forgot why. I love that. So if the original goal was so simple, we need money for roads, how on earth did it manage to hang around for 50 years, way after that mission got, well, complicated?
And here's where it gets really strange. See, the whole system that earmarked this tax money specifically for roads, that was completely scrapped back in 2009. But the tax? Oh, they kept collecting the tax. So the money just started flowing into the government's general fund with no specific purpose. It's a total contradiction, right? You've got a tax that literally has no reason to exist anymore. So you might be thinking, why didn't they just get rid of it? Well, it wasn't that simple. This thing was like a zombie tax. It wasn't just one law. It was kept alive by this incredibly complex web of different laws, acts, and ordinances. Every year, it was just easier for lawmakers to kick the can down the road and extend it rather than try to untangle that entire legal mess.
Which brings us to our next section, untangling the legal knot. Because that's exactly what it was. You couldn't just snip one thread. This was like performing really delicate surgery on the entire legal code.
So to do this properly, they had to go step by step. First, get rid of that provisional rate. Then, they had to combine the tax rates under one main law to simplify things. They also had to tweak how the tax money was distributed. But that fourth step was absolutely crucial. Think about it. Local governments had been depending on this money for decades. You couldn't just turn off the tap, so they had to create a new formula to make sure those local budgets didn't suddenly collapse. Okay, so that's all the legal stuff. But what about the real world? What did getting rid of a 50-year-old tax actually mean for regular people and for the economy? Let's dive into that ripple effect.
For households and consumers, the impact is pretty straightforward. Cheaper gas means you have more money left in your pocket at the end of the month. This was a huge deal, especially for folks in areas where you absolutely have to drive to get anywhere. And it's not just at the pump. When it costs less to transport goods, that can help push down the prices of, well, pretty much everything.
And what about businesses? Just imagine you run a trucking company or any small business that relies on deliveries. Fuel is one of your biggest expenses. For these companies, this wasn't just a nice little discount. It was a major cut in their core operating costs. That kind of change can be the difference between staying afloat and going under, which means it protects jobs and keeps our whole supply chain running.
So you can see the whole chain reaction they were hoping for. It starts with lower logistics costs. That means better profits for companies. And when companies are doing better, they can invest more, maybe hire more people. At the same time, households have more money to spend. The whole thing was designed to be a shot in the arm for the broader economy.
Okay, next section, and this is a really important point to get. This was not just another tax cut. We have to be clear here. This was different from a simple temporary subsidy. It was something way more fundamental.
And here's the difference in a nutshell. Temporary subsidies, they're basically band-aids. They're a short-term fix, they can be unreliable, and they can mess with fiscal discipline. What happened here, though, was structural reform. Think of it less like a band-aid and more like actual surgery. It was a permanent, structural solution, a real change in the system itself.
And that
brings us to our final and maybe most important section, restoring a broken principle. Because the true significance of this whole thing goes way, way beyond the price you pay for gas. This is about fixing something fundamental that was broken at the core of how the government works.
Yeah, this quote really says it all. The most important significance of this policy is the restoration of the principle that temporary measures must actually end. Think about that. For 50 years, that principle was broken. By finally ending this tax, the government was sending a message. A measure we call temporary has to actually, end someday. It's all about rebuilding trust.
So when you boil it all down, this wasn't just about making gas cheaper to win some points. It was about ending a bizarre institutional exception that had lasted for 50 years. It was about getting back to a basic fair principle. Taxes should have a clear purpose. And by finally doing that, it sets a huge precedent for any future reforms, making it easier for people to actually believe the government when it says something is temporary.
And that's really the big thought to leave you with. It makes you look around and ask, doesn't it? What other temporary things in our own lives, in our own countries, have somehow become permanent? What other systems started as a quick fix for a problem that's long gone but are still hanging around today?